And in Afghanistan, whether the warlords have a long-term political goal other than to return to a traditional tribal existence after defeating the Russians will only be shown by time. In Vietnam and Afghanistan, the commanders must now address the next stage in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare. Civil support. Both the commanders mounting the guerrilla war and those directing the counterinsurgency campaign against them must win the support of the civilian population in the areas in which they are fighting the war. A classic example of how vital civilian support can be occurred during the Algerian War of Independence. Algeria in North Africa was one of France's oldest colonies. In November 1954, the Algerian National Liberation Front, the FLN, launched a guerrilla war against France. The French settlers were outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, and the need for the authorities to gain the support of the native Algerian population seemed obvious. At first, the FLN attacked only military and government-related targets. Then, at the town of Philippeville, it killed 123 people. The French reaction was harsh. According to the French, over 1,200 guerrillas were killed. According to the FLN, 12,000 Muslims perished. Protests broke out all over the country. With this one action, the French authorities had united the native population against them. Full-scale guerrilla warfare was underway in both cities and the countryside. In Vietnam in the early 1960s, as the United States becomes increasingly involved, commanders such as Westmoreland have a problem. They're not starting from scratch, but inheriting a situation from the former French colonial occupation. The communists have already been working for years on winning the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam. They can appeal to the patriotism of the ordinary Vietnamese by portraying the United States as yet another intruder supporting a puppet regime.
To add on to that, the gloss of communism to people that had nothing was very seductive to the Vietnamese people.
To overcome this powerful appeal, the South Vietnamese government and its U.S. backers must do one thing above all: provide security from communist infiltration so that they can prove that democracy will bring stability and prosperity. Here, the communists have given them one great opportunity on which to build.
The Vietnamese communists were actually quite brutal, and when they took over a village or an area, a reign of terror soon followed. They were nonetheless able to control many communities because of the American and South Vietnamese failure to provide for adequate security.
One reason why this vital precondition for winning civilian support is not created is that essentially U.S. Commander General Westmoreland does not rate hearts and minds as very important.
And what he said is, grab the insurgents by the balls and their hearts and minds will follow.
In Vietnam, Westmoreland sees military action, rather than winning hearts and minds, as the key requirement in his battle plan for guerrilla warfare. In Afghanistan, as the first Soviet troops move in, it's also the moment when their commanders must decide whether they consider hearts and minds to be relevant. As Soviet tanks roll into Afghanistan and Soviet transports land at Bagram airfield, the problems which confront Soviet commanders in terms of hearts and minds are even more acute than those which Westmoreland faces in Vietnam. The Soviets are not just seen as invaders. They are viewed as imposing a puppet regime on the people of Afghanistan.
As a result of that, the people fled away from the Soviets and into the waiting arms of the Mujahideen. By trying to apply a puppet regime, they were actually making the Mujahideen that much stronger.
Like the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets in Afghanistan tried to win the support of the people by bringing in modern amenities, by building schools and digging wells, by bringing the benefits of modern industrial civilization to the cities. But when the Soviets do try to introduce this hearts and minds policy, it's viewed as an attempt to replace traditional local customs and values.
In fact, in Afghanistan, these measures were not merely ineffective. They had the effect of increasing the hostility of many tribesmen to the Soviet invaders. They saw the Soviet attempt at imposing modernity on Afghanistan as an assault upon their traditional way of life.
The Afghan guerrillas, in effect, don't have to do much to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, particularly the people in the harsh and inhospitable mountains where they will fight their war.
The loyalty of such people to the guerrillas was based on tribal identity, on kinship ties, on traditional loyalties that in many cases went back for centuries. In short, all the Afghan guerrillas were asking the Afghan people to do was to continue doing what they had been doing for many, many years.
In both Vietnam and Afghanistan, therefore, it's the insurgents, the communist North Vietnamese, and the Afghan Mujahideen who satisfy the hearts and minds requirements in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare, and the counterinsurgents, the Americans and the Soviets, whose hearts and minds policies are proving less effective. In Afghanistan and Vietnam, it's now time for commanders to take their campaigns on to the next requirement, arming themselves to fight a guerrilla war. Vietnam in the early 1960s, and Afghanistan 20 years later. Now the commanders in each war must address the next requirement in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare. Build up. Both sides must build up their armies. This includes both a military and a political civilian wing.
That army can be physically armed men that can take on the forces of the counterinsurgents. Or that army can be armies of converts that spread the political word to other towns and villages. Together they are very powerful and are absolutely critical if the insurgency is to move forward.
In Algeria by 1956, France's response to this requirement was to commit more than 400,000 troops, including elite airborne units and the French Foreign Legion. During 1956 and 1957, the FLN's armed force used the classic guerrilla tactics of hit and run, then merging back into the population. Kidnapping, murder, and mutilation were commonplace. In 1957, the French divided the country into sectors, each permanently garrisoned by troops responsible for suppressing guerrilla operations in their area. This reduced terrorism, but tied down large numbers of troops. The French also punished villages suspected of helping the guerrillas. They moved whole villages from the mountains to the plains. Between 1957 and 1960, more than 2 million Algerians were moved in this way. In Vietnam, as General Giap begins to engage the Americans, he already has 2 military forces at his disposal. He has a regular force, the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, which he infiltrates into the south. And he also has an insurgency force, the Viet Cong, made up of conscripts from South Vietnam itself. While building up these two forces to take on a new enemy militarily, the communists also benefit from the French withdrawal, the same situation which puts the US and South Vietnamese at such a fundamental disadvantage in the political battle for hearts and minds.
There was a transitional period between the French withdrawal and the Americans' very heavy involvement in the early 1960s. That vacuum was filled by increasing communist infiltration throughout the country. So by the time the Americans get there in force, they are fighting a battle against many tens of thousands of newly converted communists, and with that they just cannot cope.
This military advantage, which General Giap enjoys, is further underpinned by the communists' political activities.
They made an army of philosophers, people that actually spread the word to other towns and villages. They together make an incredibly seductive pact to the local people, and that is why the building of an army was such a successful phase for the insurgents.
Opposed to General Giap, U.S. General Westmoreland also has two armies, the American and the South Vietnamese. Starting in 1966, Westmoreland's High Command uses these armies to pursue a two-pronged strategy. The Americans will provide a shield behind which the South Vietnamese forces can concentrate on providing security to populated areas and winning hearts and minds. This combination of force, using overwhelming U.S. firepower, and persuasion, providing security for the rural population, should allow the communist grip to be broken and the South Vietnamese government to win the confidence of its population. In Afghanistan, in the early days of fighting, both the Soviet generals and the Mujahideen leaders